And so to review, this idea of the diminishing returns curve is based on these unequal slopes, that where you are along the curve determines what a particular value will be for an incremental unit of increase. And so you will be asked in week 4, as we get ready for the first exam, you're going to be asked to draw a diminishing returns curve and explain how a single incremental unit of resource can have a different value depending on where you are along the curve. And this is precisely the drawing that you need to do. See that if you are this far out on the curve, that incremental decrease only leads to you giving this much value away. If you are early in the curve, that incremental increase gives you a really big benefit. So reciprocal altruism it's really, though, limited to certain kinds of species. And the reason why is because there's some problems with it as a system. The expected return benefits are usually delayed, so that then provides the opportunity for cheating, shirking, or otherwise defecting. In other words, if I help you out today, or if you help me out today, why should I bother helping you out in the future? The idea that the temporal delay in being paid back then makes the system vulnerable to cheating. And so, to talk about reciprocity, to talk about the emergence of reciprocal altruism, we have to bring in a discussion of game theory. Game theory is an analytical tool, okay? It's not any one particular model of behavior, but rather it's a tool, a particular type of models that can be utilized to determine what the optimal response will be when the payoffs are frequency dependent. When we talk about mathematical modeling of behaviors of any kind of decision making process, there are two main types of models. There are optimization models and there are game theoretical models. Optimization models, your payoff does not depend on what other individuals are doing. So let's say we're talking about what your ideal dietary ratio of carbohydrates to protein is, right? That's going to be dependent, or the number of calories, even a simpler model that you have to eat. That is going to be dependent on conditions that only you yourself experience, not the decisions regarding caloric consumption that other people make. It's going to be determined by your height, by your weight, by your activity level, by your hormonal profiles, by any immune challenges that you may particularly be dealing with, etc. So there's nothing involved in that decision making process that brings in other people's decisions. So, therefore, an optimization model is the most appropriate model. By contrast, frequency dependence implies that your payoffs are determined by what other people are doing. And so the cost and benefits of a particular action that you undertake is going to depend on what other actors do. And so it's a fundamentally different type of problem. So a game theoretical approach is more appropriate for, let's say, like party attendance, right? The best place for you to spend your Friday night is not determined on by your body size, by your metabolic rate, etc. The best place for you to spend Friday night is determined by what other people in your social circle are doing. And so, you want to pick out a party to go to. That's going to be a frequency dependent problem. Parties are more fun when there are people there. So you're not going to go to the party that has the fewest attendees, right? That would be the example of a negative frequency dependence problem. You're going to go to the party that has the most attendees. That's a positive frequency dependence problem. Similarly, think about checking out at the grocery store. The line that you go to is determined not by the individual characteristics of the checker who's operating that line, but rather by how many people are already in line. This is a negative frequency dependent problem. This is where you don't want to be in the line that has the most people because that's going to take significantly longer than a line that has fewer people. So you are going to seek out a line that has fewer people and therefore a presumably shorter wait time. So these are just two examples of everyday scenarios that you may come across that would be modeled by game theory, that would be modeled with this game theoretical approach. In game theory, we typically look for the ESS, or the evolutionarily stable strategy. This is a strategy that leads to the highest payoff no matter what others do. So when the ESS is reached, that strategy can't be invaded by any other alternative strategy. So we will talk about one particular game theoretical model, the prisoner's dilemma, and we will talk about what the evolutionary stable strategy should be in a game like that. So we model reciprocal altruism by modeling a prisoner's dilemma. So the idea behind a prisoner's dilemma is that you've got a crime that's been committed. There are two prisoners who've been picked up as suspects for the crime. They're separated and they're each offered a reduced sentence if they'll implicate or rat out their partner in crime. So this is a very realistic scenario in this kind of uh, this kind of criminal accessory or accomplice case, right? That they're not going to be interrogated together. They're going to be separated for interrogation. And they're going to be potentially plea bargains that are made that reduce the sentence they'll receive if they're willing to implicate their partner, if they're willing to rat out their partner. So there are four possible strategies that the two criminals can employ. The first, both can keep their mouth shut. They're both cooperating. They may not be convicted if the police have a weak case. They're going to receive the payoff R, which is the reward for cooperation. This is a low but still non-zero chance of going to jail. So they may not be able to be implicated on the most extreme charges, but they're going to get some jail time because they'll be weak enough charges that they are able to be prosecuted for. If one partner squeals on their partner, he or she will serve 1 year or perhaps even go free as their partner receives the harshest sentence. So the person who's squealing is considered to be defecting in this context. The person who kept their mouth shut is considered to be cooperating. So the squealer's payoff is T, the temptation to defect. In a prisoner's dilemma, for a situation to qualify as a prisoner's dilemma, T has to be greater than R. So T might be going free, whereas R was a 1 year sentence for a lesser charge. For the one who keeps quiet while the friend confesses, the one who doesn't squeal goes to jail and gets the worst payoff, S, the sucker's payoff. This is going to be the lowest possible outcome, the highest possible jail time, because they are convicted. The full weight of the law comes down on them alone. They're convicted due to the partner's evidence. If they both confess, that means they both defect. They get a punishment, P, a payoff of P, which is higher than S because they helped the police, but lower than T or R because they both will serve some jail time. So they both implicate the other. They might get like a 3 year sentence. The sucker's payoff is going free. The reward for cooperation is a 1 year sentence, and the sucker's payoff would be, let's say, a 5 year sentence. The squealer's temptation to defect would be going free. And so a prisoner's dilemma doesn't have to be an interrogation situation. It's just that this was used as an illustrative way of framing a problem that's frequency dependent. And so the prisoner's dilemma refers to any payoff matrix where the rewards are such that T is greater than R is greater than P is greater than S. That means that the temptation is your best possible payoff, the reward for cooperation is your next best payoff, the punishment is your the second worst payoff, and that sucker's payoff is the worst possible outcome. So when we think of this um, as a dyadic interaction. We can set up a matrix that summarizes what our payoffs would be. So we have two players. We have two possible choices: cooperate or defect. In a prisoner's dilemma context, there is no communication between those partners. They have to make their choices independent of the other player's choices. The goal of each player is to maximize his or her payoff. We can think of a context where T is 4, R is 3, P is 2, S is 1. It could be 5, 3, 1, and 0, etc. The optimal strategy in a one-time game is for both players to defect, because the risk of that temptation and then the sucker's payoff is too great. And so if they're not close friends, they've only worked together for one crime, or if it's in that prisoners context. They don't know if they're going to see each other again and have a chance to reciprocate. Yeah, anything that really kind of focuses on the transient nature of this relationship and the fact that this is a one-time deal makes defecting the highest possible payoff. I mean, at best, you defect, your partner doesn't, you get that temptation. At worst, you get the punishment. If you were to cooperate and your partner defect, you would end up with that sucker's payoff. So they would both do better by cooperating. However, in a one-time game, they're going to, that optimal strategy, that ESS, is to always defect. And so here we have the prisoner's dilemma summarized with payoffs: 5 years, 20 years, 0 years, 1 year. The best possible outcome here is to go free, right? The best possible outcome is to defect while your partner remains silent. And so in punishments, you want the lowest value. That would be the 0 years in jail. In rewards, if we're not thinking of a prisoner context, you want the highest payoff. So here, if you both cooperate, you get a payoff of 3. If you defect while your partner cooperates, you end up with a payoff of 4. And so the easiest way to get a strategy that's different from simply always defecting is to play what we call an iterated prisoner's dilemma, or a repeated prisoner's dilemma, and to have players cooperate because they know their partner is going to cooperate. In a multi-round game, the highest payoff is going to go to those who cooperate in pairs. And so in this context of mutual cooperation, we get a reward of 3 each round. That gives us a sum total of 12 units of reward. If we play the defect strategy, the very first round we're going to get a payoff of 4. That's that temptation. But then, because we defected, our partner's going to defect, we're only going to get that punishment for mutual defection of 1. That over 4 rounds gives us a total of 7. Now, that first player, though, here in that concept of mutual cooperation, that first player, if we knew it was only going to be 4 rounds, they would get a higher payoff if they defected on the last round. So you would play cooperate, cooperate, cooperate. That would be a sum total of 9. Then defect on that last turn and get 4. That's going to give you a payoff of 13. The partner knows that and plans to expects that defection on the last round, so preemptively plans to defect on the second to last round. The first player anticipates that plan and plans to defect on the third to last round, so on and so forth. So if we have a finite number of moves, you're going to play this round for 5 iterations, you're going to play this round for 10 iterations, it will always unravel back to defect, because you're always trying to get one up on your partner. So the best way to foster a different strategy is not to have a finite number of rounds, but rather to introduce a probabilistic outcome for future interactions. And so in this context, where we've got a probabilistic outcome, we are, depending on what that probability is of meeting in the future, we are much more likely to see cooperation become established. And so Axelrod and Hamilton decided to model and come up with the ESS for the prisoner's dilemma by running a computer tournament. And so there were a series of tournaments in which participants submitted a strategy in the form of a computer program. Those strategies then played against all other strategies that were submitted. In the first iteration, there were 14 strategies submitted. Each strategy faced off against itself and faced off against all others. And the most robust strategy, the one that won, the one that became the evolutionarily stable strategy, was a strategy called tit for tat, submitted by Anatol Rappaport. So, what tit for tat states is to cooperate on the first round, and then on every round after that, use the same strategy that your opponent played. So, if your opponent cooperates on the first round, you will cooperate on the second round. If your opponent defects on the first round, you will defect on the first round. Because you're cueing into what your opponent does, tit for tat allows a momentary state of defection to go back to mutual cooperation if your partner is willing to go back to mutual cooperation. So the second tournament had many more strategies submitted, had a total of 62 strategies. This tournament was an ecological tournament. I'll explain that in just a second. Again, tit for tat emerged as a winner. So what do we mean by an ecological tournament? Well, the first tournament simply had a finite number of or a probabilistic outcome, probabilistic likelihood of future interaction that simply stayed constant. So you had like a zero point 0.7 likelihood that you would interact in the future, or you'd have a zero point 0.4 likelihood that you'd interact in the future. This ecological tournament bases that probabilistic likelihood for future interaction on your outcome. So if you have a favorable outcome, that is mutual cooperation, you continue to interact with that individual. If you have a disfavorable outcome, let's say you cooperate but your partner defects, then you cease interacting with that individual. And so this is much more likely to occur in real life scenarios. You engage in cooperation, you engage in this kind of pro-social behavior, and if you get a positive feedback, you get a good outcome from that pro-social behavior, you're willing to keep cooperating. You're willing to continue to engage in pro-social behavior. We seek out people with whom we have favorable social experiences. We tend to avoid people with whom we've had negative social experiences. So what kinds of conditions favor tit for tat? Well, you've got to have a good memory for scorekeeping. You've got to have the ability to punish defectors and reward cooperators. And so, tit for tat and reciprocal altruism they are going to be more likely in species that have higher cognition, particularly species that have what we call a social brain or Machiavellian intelligence. That is, species where the cognition exists. Such that you can imagine others' mental states. You recognize that other individuals, you have theory of mind, you recognize that other individuals have mental states that may be different from yours. And you pay attention to social cues to be able to infer or read what those mental states are. So social species like canids, like apes, like humans, like elephants, these are the kinds of species where we would expect reciprocity to occur, where we would expect this ability to monitor payoffs and to punish cheaters, etc. We also expect for reciprocity to occur when there's a shadow of the future, when you expect to see scenarios where you have relatively long-term interactions with the same partners over and over again. And so this is going to vary based on dispersal patterns, based on lifespan, etc. So we don't expect to see reciprocity emerge in species that have really short lifespans. Similarly, we don't expect to see reciprocity emerge in solitary species that only come together socially during the breeding season, or in species where there are incredibly high rates of dispersal and you're not likely to interact with the same individuals over and over and over again. So we can look to these cues, these ecological cues, these life history cues, and come up with our expectations of the kinds of species in which we would expect to see evidence for reciprocal altruism. Tit for tat is characterized as being nice. What does that mean? Well, tit for tat always starts with cooperation. So they make that overture. The strategy makes the overture of working together or cooperating first. Tit for tat is retaliatory. That means that it punishes non-cooperators. Tit for tat will um, defect if you defect on tit for tat. Um, Tit for tat is also forgiving. It will go back to cooperating if the other player goes back to cooperating. So it's not as if you make one transgression and you violate the that agreement of cooperation, and then you're defected upon from there on out. So these are the characteristics that make tit for tat a very robust, very strong strategy. It's nice, it's retaliatory, it's forgiving. Tit for tat is an example of reciprocal altruism. Individual A provides benefit to individual B at time 1 and incurs a cost. Individual B provides benefit to individual A and incurs a cost at time 2. They both take on those roles. They both assume the costs. They both assume the benefits. It's just asynchronous in time. And so if we look at how tit for tat fares playing against effect, tit for tat doesn't win when it's playing against effect. Why? Because that very first interaction, defect gets that temptation payoff. Tit for tat will start off by cooperating and then receive the sucker's payoff for that very first interaction. Um, the likelihood that tit for tat is going to be able to become established in a population is going to dramatically increase if tit for tat is introduced in groups. That is, you introduce more than one tit for tat strategy at the same time, and tit for tat plays each other. And so if tit for tat seeks out another tit for tatter and plays each other, over 10 rounds we're going to receive a payoff of 30, which is dramatically better than the payoff of 22 that a defector would get when playing with tit for tat. So we have um, this problem of how do we expect for tit for tat or reciprocity or cooperation to emerge or to invade a population that is all defect. And really the answer to that question is that we allow tit for tat to enter with another tit for tat, and we allow them to preferentially seek out strategies that give them high payoffs. And so in this ecological context, this ecological tournament, these conditions are met. Tit for tat plays against itself as well, and in those games against itself, those rounds against itself, tit for tat wins massively because of mutual cooperation.